This is the penultimate late for 2010. As you know, if you've been here before, the theme for the entire series has been innovation. Tonight we're looking at the environment. So if I were to pick one word that is as overused as it is misunderstood, I might pick the word sustainability. Every business and government department, it seems, has adopted it as a mantra, yet how many of us can properly say that we know what it would entail in real life and in practical terms? We are repeatedly reminded also of our supposedly clean and green image, and just as often chastised for not living up to it. The government's emissions trading scheme is hailed as a move in the right direction by some, while its critics either say it's too much too soon or far too little too late. And all the while, despite the best efforts of scientists, politicians, writers and lobbyists, climate change skepticism persists, and surely not only because of the media's desire for two sides to every story. Later this month, the UN Climate Change Conference reconvenes in Cancun, Mexico, to try and pick up where Copenhagen left off, which according to many wasn't far enough in terms of emissions reduction progress. So what is the ordinary layperson to make of all this? Is it feasible, for instance, that we strive for this thing called sustainability while still encouraging a model of economic growth that depends on extractive industry and ever-increasing consumption? And what would the impact of a market be that priced in the true environmental costs of production? These and other questions I will put to tonight's panel, so without further ado, let me introduce them. Next to me is Simon Terry, former investment banker and financial journalist and now the Executive Director of the Sustainability Council of New Zealand, as well as manager of an economics consulting partnership. Both roles involve extensive research on issues including climate change, response strategies, and the mechanisms for boosting renewable energy uptake. Guy Salmon in the middle here, third-generation conservationist, and not many of us can say that, co-founder of the Native Forests Action Council in 1975, I believe, later as chief executive of the Maruia Society, now the Ecologic Foundation. He has focused on the challenge of integrating economic and environmental perspectives in decision-making. He's currently leading a 4-year comparative study of sustainable development in New Zealand and the Nordic countries. And finally, Nando Tanchos was a Green MP from 1999 to 2008, where he became well known as a campaigner for environmental issues, justice and constitutional reform. He has also been, in his own description, a businessman and a beggar, a legislator and an outlaw, and is currently a community educator, freelance writer and orator, and is growing his dreads back, so he tells me. Please welcome our guests. How do you find, as someone who's trying to disseminate this information and get it into the corridors of power and into the discussions, how do you find it's received and how do you find it's reported as well?
I think, as Guy said, it's difficult. It really is difficult because there are many keen reporters who are interested in the issue, but it goes in fashion cycles almost. Leading up to Copenhagen, everything was awash with climate, but because it didn't produce a result, it's like that's not a news story anymore. And so you wait for the next Al Gore film, The Inconvenient Truth, and up it pops again. The travesty of all this is that the climate numbers, just every year we put in another 2 or 3 parts per million into the atmosphere. And nature just keeps on ticking away. It doesn't respect politics, it doesn't do bailouts. And as those numbers crunch, we get closer and closer to this time where we start to lose options. I think perhaps what's most interesting this year, in response to your question, Finlay, is watching some of the leading writers on this and thinkers who've been following this for 20 years or more. A whole series of them this year have sort of gone, my goodness, maybe it's getting too late. Not just James Lovelock anymore, but people like Bill McKibben, a very good writer, has pretty much said it's every community for themselves at this point. You find David Suzuki is thinking we haven't got that much to work with at the moment. Clive Hamilton, the leading Australian author, has pretty much said game over, it's requiem for a species. I don't believe it's nearly that bad. In fact, I would put to you that we've still got options. We've got to reframe the thinking an awful lot. It's not just about changing from we've got to stop emitting carbon to we've got to suck some down as well. It's really retooling in a way, thinking about how different societies focused on and drove challenges when they really recognized a challenge. I mean, the American response to the Second World War is often quoted in industrial literature as how they just turned an economy on a dime. Roosevelt just went up to the car makers and said, guys, you're not making private cars for 3 years, you're making tanks, you're making planes, whatever else. In a year's time, it was totally flipped around. Now,
so it's a war against carbon. That's what we need.
One would like to think that we could create a more cooperative and harmony.
I mean, the way we removed CFCs from the environment is a sort of slightly smaller example, unless I'm wrong. It was possible. Everyone suddenly realised, ooh, fly spray bad.
It was good, but also DuPont had the next technical fix for not much money. This one costs. Currently, you're talking $10 trillion in forestry plantings if you wanted to suck down the amount that's in excess in the atmosphere, at least on James Hansen's numbers. That's a lot of dough. $1 trillion is 5 times the output of the New Zealand economy, more or less. It's not the kind of money that can't be easily taken by a world economy over time, but it requires real commitments. It requires people to think about what will they not have in place of what they're having now. And often that turns out not to be a necessity, it turns out to be a fashion good. In 1960, Americans were consuming only a third of the amount of stuff that they are consuming today. Happy Days didn't look like a picture of rural poverty to me.
I want to talk about alternative ways of thinking about the economy later, but I also don't want to move too fast beyond what you were saying earlier, which can be interpreted as an alarmist, apocalyptic message. And I wonder any of the panelists have any views about the perhaps self-defeating nature of talking about the end of the world, such as some of these writers you mentioned have done. And whether that plays into what I talked about earlier, skepticism, climate change skepticism and denial persisting so strongly that it's just a rejection of a message that just sounds ridiculous. When you walk outside, the sun still shines and you breathe the air and so on and so forth. I mean, is there a danger in just simply being a doomsayer?
I think there are. Yes, you can create a very negative impression for people. And I mean, one of the things talking about the question of sustainability, it's sustainability of what? For who? You know, so you can look at a number of the ecological issues. You can talk about the need to reduce consumption, and for many people, it's like we're giving up everything we've gained. But then I think you've got to present the arguments about what is it that you gain instead, and it's kind of what you're saying. If you look at the indexes of well-being, the research that I've seen suggests that, for example, in the United States, well-being and happiness hasn't increased since about the 1950s or 60s. So there's been this consumption of all this stuff, and it hasn't actually made people any happier. So I think we have to reframe the question in terms of what are the things that really matter to us? Is it another PlayStation, a TV in everyone's bedroom, or whatever it is? And actually start to think about, if we're talking about creating a sustainable society, what is it that's important to sustain? And it's not the stuff. It's, you know, what is our relationships, our democracy, our freedoms, our intellectual culture, our knowledge. These are the things that are really important.
I think most people would agree with that, but I'm still intrigued as to why skepticism about climate change in the face of the evidence we're told exists persists. Do you have any theories, Guy?
I think skepticism is largely a product of vested interests promoting it. And the trick to overcome this is to bring a more inclusive type of politics in which the industries that feel they stand to lose from climate change policy are bought in and are part of a negotiation of a solution.
But they do stand to lose from it. Well,
it's not as simple as that. You look at the dairy industry in New Zealand. On the face of it, they could lose a lot. But when you start looking at some of the strategies that they could use to reduce their emissions, which of course people don't like to do. But if you do persist a bit, you discover that there's quite a lot of these that are very low cost opportunities, quite simple things like, for example, we have this greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. It's very big. Most of it comes from the South Island during winter when cows' urine is falling on cold waterlogged soils. By simply getting those animals and putting them in a barn or on a feed pad, collecting the urine, not allowing it to get onto the soil, you can, at fairly low cost and with a modest change to the farming system, make some big reductions in that greenhouse gas, which is a big number. So I think it's very important to focus on those countries that have been successful in making, at least starting this transition to a low carbon economy. And I've had the incredible privilege over the last few years of studying 3 of them: Finland, Sweden and Denmark. Denmark, incidentally, a big dairy exporting country like us. I was studying them with colleagues at the University of Helsinki, and the question we were asking was, how come these countries have been so much more successful at getting their greenhouse gas emissions down while still having very high economic growth rates, doing better than New Zealand on both counts, and also solving a whole lot of their other environmental problems at the same time? And what it really came down to, and just I should say that, you know, back in the Rio conference in 1992, that's 18 years ago now, New Zealand undertook to stabilise its greenhouse gas emissions at their 1990 levels by the year 2000. 18 years on, and our gross emissions are 24% above the 1990 level. But Sweden, Finland and Denmark all have gross greenhouse gas emissions below the 1990 level, in some cases significantly below. How did they do that? Well, there's a whole lot of technical things that I could tell you about, but the interesting thing really is the politics of it. And the politics of it is countries that sit down around the table and work through solutions in a collaborative manner. And that style of decision-making, which we call collaborative governance, is enormously promising, I think, for tackling a lot of these problems. Because, in a sense, it's a question of paying respect to each other. We can say to the dairy industry, look, we know that you guys are really important for earning our livelihood, but on the other hand, you're also the biggest source of emissions. Can we talk about how we're going to tackle this problem together? That's essentially what was going on in those 3 Nordic countries and how they were able to make such progress.
It does sound rather a long way from the New Zealand situation. The farmers have been given a free ride as far as my reading of the of emissions trading legislation has gone. And they seem also to be running their own, well, agriculture in general seems to be running its own campaign to put us off going down that route.
Absolutely. It's true, agriculture is yet to factor in responsibility for emissions into its production, and in fact there are some amazing opportunities to reduce those at no or low cost. Currently the climate of skepticism around climate change with the farmers seems to be preventing that being accepted as something that farmers could translate into a brand advantage, into a leading way forward.
Do you find that the agricultural community is resistant to the message that climate change is real?
Yes, that's the starting point, and then it becomes almost climate is a vehicle for victimising farmers or putting extra costs that other competitors are not facing.
And it's a bit town versus country?
There are elements of that, but I think there's a deep lack of understanding as to a common set of principles and the science to work through on, and perhaps picking up on what Guy was saying. Perhaps there's a common language between all the skeptics and everybody that comes down to risk. Everybody after the Canterbury earthquake disaster is already reinforced in their mind that house insurance is a damn good idea. 90% of them were apparently insured to start with, and you'd be looking hard to find somebody who didn't think that was a good payoff. Well, hell, people spend $1,000 a year roughly on their house insurance. That's for a fire that will take place once in a blue moon to somebody. For some other natural disasters, earthquakes possibly, but overall it's for a very rare event that you're insuring against. Climate, the science is very, very strong that we will get a degree. It's a risk equation, we don't really know how the system will unfold, but You'd think if you're prepared to spend that amount of money on a might happen, which is only going to affect your house, you'd be prepared to spend a lot more on something you could actually fix, not like an earthquake, which you have no control over, but you could actually fix it and hold off something really dire to you and future generations. I mentioned culture here is so important because it's culturally acceptable to not take responsibility for your carbon emissions, but people would look pretty oddly at you if you had a house that was uninsured. If we took that insurance money, $1.4 billion a year, that actually would offset half New Zealand's emissions just that way. And it could even be a vehicle to a transition to a different economy.
If some of these technical fixes in agriculture are as relatively cheap and simple to effect as you say, what's the problem? Where's the resistance?
The problem is to engage the agriculture sector and pay respect to their concerns and persuade them that there is a way forward. And these technical solutions, they need a price signal to get uptake. So, for example, we've got a big problem with the ETS because agriculture is being exempted. And yet, when you build a new irrigation project in the South Island, you've got two choices about how to use the land in Canterbury, for example. If once you've put on the irrigation, you plant it in crops, then you've got quite low greenhouse gas emission consequences. It's a relatively okay thing to do from a climate point of view. Alternatively, you could put the same irrigated land into dairying, and as soon as you put it into dairying, you have a huge increase in the emissions that result from the irrigation project. Now, what we need to have is a price signal there, which says, hey, if you're going to go into dairying, it's going to cost you more to use this land than if you go into cropping. And that signal alone would just save us a huge amount of the growth in emissions which is otherwise going to occur.
And yet, but time is short, Simon.
Time is short. New Zealand is one of the most privileged places in the world to begin this reconstruction. Our resources are extraordinary by comparison to other nations. We have greater ability to generate electricity renewably than just about anywhere else. The land we have to grow trees, to take alternative types of agriculture forward rather than necessarily emissions intensive or livestock intensive. The pastures are definitely very green here. It's about, as the guy was saying, a question of strategy. We haven't had a strategy that would look forward to these kind of resource constraints and how our customers overseas will respond and look to us to lead on those resource constraints, where supermarkets in Europe are regularly labelling for carbon, increasingly will label for water content, for whether an animal has been treated properly, whether the GM content is in or out. These things are, in high-value markets that we seek to service, are increasingly important.
So the visionary political party or government is going to be the one that takes that very seriously and actually starts to remodel the economy to some extent. You agree? Is that going to happen? I mean, I don't see that happening with this government, with all due respect.
I do. I think that we already have some models as to how Kiwi companies can emerge into a high-tech space and grow and become big exporters. Fisher & Paykel Healthcare is an example. And the issue here is just getting away from that very free market type of politics that we had bequeathed to us by the 1980s and get into a space of doing what other countries do, which is choose what kind of industries they want to foster. And we can choose low environmental impact industries and through advancing our research and development budget and our industry policy activities, give a boost to the whole idea of diversifying into sustainable industries.
Can I give another, just in terms of my view of sustainability for New Zealand, I mean, the other issue that we're not talking about is the coming energy crisis in terms of the plateauing out of conventional oil resources. I was seeing an article by George Monbiot recently talking about the revised projections of the International Energy Agency, saying that they're expecting a plateau of conventional oil supplies by 2020. That's 10 years away. 10 years is not even enough time to prepare our economy for that kind of change. And I mean, that's the whole other thing that we're talking about. And for me, one of the elements, if we're going to talk about a sustainable New Zealand, that we actually also have to start looking at is becoming a more self-reliant country, and not just focusing on where we're going to earn the export dollars, but how we're actually going to provide more of the needs of New Zealanders, generate those internally.
Do you agree?
I'm not convinced we need to turn internally in self-reliance. If we make it through this hump, we will still have a globalized trading world, but it'd be much less material intensive. The flows, if people spend more time on the internet and grow businesses which are carbon light and resource light, you can have growth, but it does come back to very finite limits about what ecosystems can handle, which is the underlying support system. And that's where perhaps more of the self-reliance, that it'll turn out to be cheaper and better to make things here in a way that we used to rather than import them. But it doesn't place a restriction on, a globalized interactive economy.
Sure. As what Donald said, trade is the spice of life, but it's not he said the meat and potatoes of a healthy national diet. And, that's right, there will always be trade, and there's always been global trade. I mean, in the Pacific, the Polynesians were trading all through the Pacific for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that will continue, but it seems to me that we are going to have to relocalize a lot of our economy, much more than we do now. And certainly in terms of basic needs, it makes no sense to be trucking biscuits and things like this all over the world.
It's been a real privilege for me to share the stage with these three extremely knowledgeable and committed human beings. So would you please join me in thanking Nandor Tanchos, Guy Salmon and Simon Terry.